gave you an assignment before the class was done. Remember what that assignment was? He says, I want you to go and read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 31, and see what you can learn from there that would help a church to be like the Philadelphia church and to help prevent a church from being like the Sardis church. Now, raise your hand if you remember that. Only one person, David. 2 people. Okay. But I would like to do that this morning because it does fit within the idea, the scope of what we're looking at. And I meant to make, that's readable. Could have been a little bigger. So let's go ahead and take a moment and read 1 Corinthians 1, 26 through 31. The Apostle Paul, when he writes this to the church of Corinth, he says, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised, God has chosen. And the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. But of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and righteousness from sanctification and redemption, that as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. Now, what's interesting about this, and I believe David in this comparison there, and David's here, he could always help enlighten us to that. When you stop and think about the letter to the church in Sardis, and the problems that the Sardisians, I don't know, Sardisians, Sardonians, Sardines. Anyway, the brethren there in Sardis there, as y'all talked about, he observes, he says, I know your works. And they had a reputation for being alive, but they were what? Dead. Exactly. Now, he tells them to wake up and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of God. Now, looking at it from man's wisdom, if we were to go back to what Paul said there, you know, you have those who are wise according to the flesh. You have those who are mighty according to the flesh. You have those who are noble according to the flesh. This was a really good congregation. Look at all the great works that they did. That's right, in the eyes of man. And they probably patted themselves on the back, thought everything was fine and dandy. But when Jesus looked at those works, what did he say again about that? He says, I know your works. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. He says, you're not, the works are not complete in the sight of my God. He says there in verse 2. Now, on the other hand, as we look at the church there in Philadelphia, kind of jump forward to the start of that, he says, I know your works. There's that phrase again. But this time he says, behold, I have set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. So it looked like Philadelphia was basing their, I'll rephrase that. They were striving to meet whose standards? Exactly. The Lord's standards, not man's standards. Now, what makes this really relevant in this day and age is because the number of denominations that exist, the number of quote-unquote churches that assemble every Sunday, and some Saturdays, some on other days, but a lot of them have become nothing more than men pleasers, or have been fashioned after what can bring people in, and how to attract people and things like that. And you know, when someone's sitting there worshiping, as far as what they would call worship, they may not say to themselves, wow, I'm really being entertained. This is like going to the movie. But in the end, ultimately, that is what goes on. There's a lot of other things pointing that. But if we try to judge ourselves based off the Word of God and the standards established by Christ, then we are thinking in a way that is not wise according to the world, but wise according to God, and which is ultimately the greater wisdom that we are to follow. And you see that in congregations, which way they go, what they focus on, the things that they do, look at what they teach. Ultimately, who are we trying to please? And that's the question. Yeah. David, go ahead.
You caught us to play what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. This is God chose the base things, base in the eyes of men. It's the same thing going back to verse 21. He chose the preaching of the gospel to save souls, where men wanted it to be something grandiose. They wanted thunder on mountains or earthquakes or some great works to go along with it. God chose simply the preaching of the gospel. So in his simplicity, salvation has power. But in man's, in their intricacy, they diminish power. So Paul had the same thing to say in 2 Timothy chapter 3, that men have a form of godliness but deny the power. We need to appreciate the base things. When we talk about base things, we talk about the simplicity that's in Christ. We need to appreciate that it's not about buildings with specially tinted glass or paintings on the ceilings or any of that kind of things in the eyes of men where they awe at themselves. It's the simple things, unleavened piece of bread and fruit of the vine, that we remember such great events that God has done on our behalf. It's in these base things that God is elevated and man is diminished. And in that simplicity comes then the concept that God has great things to think about us versus what men may think. We change the way we think about these things. It changes our hearts in the presentation of God. And we care more about the simple things. We care more about the nature of our hearts. And we care more about what the Word's supposed to be doing to our hearts than we do about whether or not we've got a fancy building or this or that.
That's right. Any questions or any comments about that? That's a good comparison, showing, kind of the fundamental seed at what produces one versus the other one. And it should cause every Christian to step back and ask themselves, what is at the heart of their service? Is it to serve the Lord, or is it to please men? Is it to walk according to his fellowship, or walk in a way that would make more sense to the world? And so much more we could look at. But what I want to come back to now is in the text there. Y'all talked about last week his phrase there in verse 7 and verse 8. He who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. And then he says, I know your work. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut that door, or no one can shut it. Who opened that door for them? Jesus says, I have set before you an open door. Well, why? Because of their faithfulness, because they walked within his fellowship, because they were serving him. They were walking by his authority. They were abiding by his word. He says, you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. It's not enough to simply do a handful of works and we call it good. It's got to be a service from the heart and in accordance to the authority set forth in the scriptures. And once he opens that door will not be shut now unless what? That's right. Unless we shut that door. Unless we stop serving him. All right. Any thoughts or comments about that? All right. So let's see. Let me jump over there to verse, no, not quite verse 10 yet. Yeah. So some of the things that the church in Philadelphia was facing, we see really there in verse 9 the pressure that was faced, that they were having to deal with. And you'll notice there he says there in verse 9, indeed I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. So depending on when you put the writing of this, and I guess it would still be the same in either time frame, but maybe even more so at the earlier date. When we look at the letter to the churches throughout Galatia, one of the things becomes evident, especially about Acts chapter 15, is that there were a lot of false teachers. They called themselves followers of God, but they were Jews. They were still binding the law of Moses. They were still trying to make those people who profess to believe in Christ to also hold to something that they felt had to be abided by. And in the course of doing this would have yielded, not a collective spirit of let's work together, but a great persecution, a hardship upon the Christians. An example of this would be the Apostle Paul. When Paul was on his journeys, especially his first journey, who were the troublemakers in each city? They're the Jews. What would they do? The Jewish leaders would come in and they would stir up the people of the city against Paul. And then he goes from Thessalonica down to Berea, and things are going well, and the Jewish troublemakers follow him down to Berea, and they do the same thing. And so we shouldn't think that by the time the 7 churches of Asia are receiving this message from Jesus, that things are any different. And so in the course of this great persecution, what did they continue to confess? The Christians. Yeah, they continued to confess the name of Christ in the midst of these persecutions. He says, who say they're Jews and are not, but lie. If they were truly Jews, who would they have been serving? Jesus. Okay, sounds like a trick question, doesn't it? But Paul makes the point in Romans chapter 4 and 5 that the one who has the faith of Abraham is really the true Jew, if you would, the true descendant of Abraham. Fundamentally, when the Jews professed to serve God, but yet they worked against Christ, they worked against the church, they were not serving the Lord, but they were serving the ruler of this world. And so he calls him as such, synagogue of Satan. They weren't Satan worshipers as people would paint today, but in their service, they were working against the church and therefore fell within this description here. The latter half we'll talk about in just a second. Any thoughts or any comments? Dan.
The Jews shutting doors that Christ had opened.
They were tempted to. And some were listening to them.
Yeah. They were trying to close the door that Christ opened to certain groups of people. They thought they were the only ones that could pass through this door.
Yeah, the whole concept of the Gentiles, anyone who wasn't a Jew, being acceptable unto God, fully and equally acceptable unto God, was not something that they entertained.
So the next question is, so if you've got two, I'm going to say opposite sides here, ones who are seeking to serve the Lord, and one who decide which is seeking to work against the Lord. How do you find out who's really right? Wait until what? Wait until the judgment. And I don't mean the judgment day, but look at the judgment of the Lord. All right, Jesus in his authority, when you think about Ephesians chapter 2, the household of God is built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. There is a solid, proven authority sent by God. So he says here in the latter half, indeed I will make them come and worship before your feet. This is to say that at some point they are going to be humbled. And these individuals whom he calls are of the synagogue of Satan. These individuals will at some point learn the lesson that the side they walked on was not God's. And the people that they were persecuting were God's. And they will have this humbled reality brought upon them. And they will know, as he says here, that I have loved you. Who did God love more? Now this is based on what Paul says, I think, in his Galatian letters. Who did God love and who did he hate, Jacob or Esau? He hated Esau, he loved Jacob. Now, when you go back and look at the actual story, that's not so much the picture that's painted there, but Paul uses that to make a point. And so it's much like this right here. All right? Those who worship the Lord and serve the Lord and follow the Lord, those are the ones, as in the context of here, they know that I've loved you. He has saved you. He sent his son to die for you. Those who chose to walk contrary to that path, don't fall in that category. So we say, yeah, but doesn't God love everybody? He does, and that's why he sent Jesus to die upon the cross of Calvary. But only those who fully submit into his will and serve him are those who walk within the category of the brethren here in Philadelphia. Any thoughts? Any comments? David?
I said a couple of things here. For comparison to Esau, Esau represents everybody who loves the world and curses them. Obadiah, the one chapter of the prophet Obadiah, is prophesying concerning God's judgment on Edom, the descendants of Esau. And that's a universal understanding God has as they represent those who love the world versus God. The statement in verse 9, though, Paul explains that in Romans chapter 10. They have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. So this represents the synagogue of Satan, which I find unique, by the way, that you'll note the Lord, he doesn't mince words. If you're not for me, you are against me, which means you serve the other master. But they represent those who want to serve God, and they want God to yield to them, not the other way around. So in chapter 9 of Romans, Paul says, Israel is not Israel of the flesh. Israel now is Israel of the promise. And that's the promise made to Abraham. And Paul, in chapter 11, verse 1 of Romans, demands that we understand that God didn't forsake Israel. Look at me, he says. He introduces himself as an example because he chose to serve God through Christ. There is only one way to God. Moses doesn't get it done again. So to that end, if they continue to serve Moses, his traditions, his circumcision, all those things that came through the law, they're serving the wrong master. And that would be true to this day.
You made a statement in there I thought was very interesting. I mean, all of it was interesting, but a particular one. When we stop and think about what Satan is wanting from us, he's wanting us not so much to reject and walk away from God, but to submit unto him. We can still follow God all that we want to, but he still wants us to submit unto him. Now, let me tell you why I say that, and it's a good point. Think about when Jesus was tempted. In the temptations that Satan offered to Jesus, none of the temptations really was saying, deny everything and come live ungodly and do all the worldly things that I want you to do. It was basically, rely on me. Submit to me. Prove to me. You need to prove to me that you're the Son of God. I need to be satisfied. So throw yourself off the temple and he'll save you. Okay? Hungry? Well, listen to what I have to say. Go ahead and turn the stones into bread. You can do that. I'll feed you. That's kind of what he was saying there. I'll feed you. Just do what I say. Turn the stones bread. The other one was, took him on the high spot, showed him all the glories. He says, all you got to do is bow down and worship me, and all things will be given to you. And you can still serve God. You can still do whatever you want to do. Just bow down and worship me. And that's what he's going for. It's not completely to abandon and walk away from everything, but just simply to do and submit unto him. And you can serve God all you want to, but as long as you do what he would have you to do, Satan, that is. And that's ultimately what's being seen here. That's a good point, David. I hadn't thought about that. Any thoughts or any comments? Debbie.
This is Jesus talking, right?
Correct.
Okay, and he says, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. But at the beginning of that section, it says, to the angel of the church. So who is you?
The Christians, the saints in Philadelphia, the church of Philadelphia.
That I have loved, that I will worship before your feet. That's the saints.
Yep, he says, indeed I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you.
Now think about this for just a moment, kind of the imagery here with this imagery. When you think about I'm not sure, but let's call it a war, okay? Who ends up serving whom? Does the defeated serve the victor? Or does the victor serve the defeated? The defeated end up serving and submitting to the victor. Now, this is not to say, I'm not trying to say that in that sense that they become our servants, something like that. But it shows that in the end, the victory belongs to Christ and to those who follow him. And those who don't follow him will know in that day who it was that was right with the Lord and walked with the Lord. And as Paul even says that at his name, every knee shall bow, but those in heaven and those under heaven and so forth and so on. At least that's one way of looking at that, Debbie. Yeah. Not a sense of true worship as we become deity, nothing like that. It's that we walk with Christ and we'll have victory in him. And they won't. Yeah. Ms. Kira.
Mentioned something that raised a question for me when I'm looking at Matthew 6:24, and it says no one can serve two masters. Talking about either God, in this case money, but you kind of mentioned that you can still serve God, but you can still, follow the devil. But
Okay, keep in mind the context what I was talking about.
This is what the devil wants people to think. The devil wants people to think you can serve him and you go ahead and go to church, go do stuff like that, make God happy, but as long as you serve me. It doesn't work that way. You and I both know that. Okay. As soon as an individual begins to do and submit to the will of the devil, no amount of outward pretense of worship is seen by God. And so it was more within that context. The devil's trying to coax an individual serving him. He's not telling them to abandon God in the way that we might think of it, where now we go worship some weird statue and red stuff and all that other stuff. All we got to do is do what he would like for us to do, and then we can still do our other stuff. It doesn't work that way. That's what he's going for. God says you can't serve two masters. From the standpoint of the Christian, it's like having a man who has a wife and then has a lady on the side. At some point, that's going to fall apart. You can't do both. The church is the bride of Christ. So we can't have some other head that we submit to. As soon as we do, we're no longer the bride of Christ. As Christians, we leave that fellowship. Yeah. Miss Kathy.
Somebody accused me of, I guess, living my life in the black and white. And I accused them and said that most people live in the gray. So what God is saying, pick a side. And you can't be on both sides. So I think that clarifies it more, because they think you're too harsh, or you're too strict, or you're too rigid. And I think my question is, can you be too rigid? Because if we're following God and what he wants, then they say, well, maybe you don't have enough love. Or maybe you don't care, you don't have enough compassion. But the thing is you have to lead somebody to God's side and allow them to start acting on those instead of what Satan says when he casts out, or he says you'll be okay. I think that's what you were trying to say.
You think about the church, well, in Ephesus. What did they left? Their first love. They were doing a bunch of other good stuff, but at the heart, they left their first love. It's got to be, our service unto God has got to be complete in accordance to his word. And if we seek to serve ourselves, if we seek to serve our spouses, if we seek to serve our employers, if we seek to serve our friends, if we seek to please the world in any form or fashion, then we're no longer serving the Lord. And that's the scary part, because we can be going through all the right motions. We can come to services twice a week. We can come to services on Wednesday night. We can come to all the gospel. We can go to all the Bible classes. But that's only 4 hours a week. If in the rest of the days of the week, we're serving the world, we're serving the devil, we're serving ourselves, then we're no different than the church in Laodicea. No different than the church in Sardis. We've got to have a heart in service unto God, and therefore make all the decisions in our life according to his word and not according to ourself and our worldly desires or what others would have us to do. It's got, every morning you get up, I was going to say when you get up in the morning you're ready to go to work, doesn't brush their hair. And I looked over and saw Myron, so be a bad example of that. But most of the time, you have to look at that mirror to tell. Sorry. I looked at him. David's got a little bit still sticking up there. But you look at the mirror before you go out in the morning, and you look for problems. You fix the problems before you go out to the world. We got to look into our hearts and fix the problems in our service unto God. And then our service truly will be loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Who had her hand up? Myron. Okay.
Yeah, so on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says in chapter 7 of Matthew, verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. And many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness." There are thousands of people this morning who are going to buildings all over the Oklahoma City area who believe that what they're doing is following after the Lord. But Jesus says here that only those who do the will of my Father will he actually know. And so we can make all these claims of things that we're doing in the Lord's name, but is that in the will of him? And so similar to what we're seeing with some of these churches in Revelation, here we have Christians even, right, who are claiming that they're following the will of the Lord, and they're not. So you can even have Christians who are still not doing the will of the Lord. And so I think it's very important that we always go back to the Bible to see what the Lord's will is. Because whether you're a Christian or you're not, you can still not be known by him.
That's right. That's why he told the church at Sardis, be watchful, and then, therefore, if you will not watch, I'll come upon you. What does John 14:16 say?
I'm going to say it, so don't look it up, because if I'm wrong, it's not the right verse, I don't want to know. If you love me, do what? Keep my commandments. And who did Jesus say that to? His apostles. Okay. Maybe 16:14. Anyway, but that's the point. And what you're saying, that's exactly right. You've got to seek his will, and you've got to love him with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then you have a service that he finds acceptable. Because see, we've talked about this before. The Lord looks into our hearts. I can't look into your heart. I may see actions and make some guesses and everything. Same thing. You can look at me and my actions and my words, and you might make some guesses, and sometimes what you do outwardly does show ultimately what's in your heart. But the Lord knows without a doubt, without a facade, without a pretense. He knows our hearts and our minds and our thoughts. And that's why our service begins there. David.
Well, the bottom of verse 8, it says, have kept my word and have not denied my name. Now, if you reverse engineer that real quick, going back to what Byron's talking about, they did not, in their lives, at Philadelphia, deny his authority, which then led them to keep his word. But more importantly, you can't keep what you don't know. And to Myron's statement, there are many people out here today who claim to be something that they can't defend. They have no way of telling you why. They have no way of telling you what the Lord really expects of them in their lives. They have no foundation in what God has shared for them to be who they say they are. So at the end of the day, the question becomes the difference between Philadelphia and Smyrna. Smyrna claimed to be something big, but God saw them virtually not at all. Philadelphia has not made such a claim. He says, you have a little strength, he says, in the eyes of men. But God proclaims them out loud by their works. And we talked a lot about that the week before, talking about Smyrna and how first century Christians understood from God's teaching what was represented from the inside out. And to this end, we had better know. We have Bible classes. We have study material. We have time to sit down in the course of a week to know the will of God. What will our excuse be in that day that we don't know what this says and what it expects of us? What will our excuse be?
To the point. Any other thoughts?
All right, let's go into verse number 10. So in continuing this thought there, he talks about, and they will learn that I have loved you because, now, this goes back to what Debbie, kind of what you asked a while ago. Let's continue this thought process here. All right, so he says that they will come and worship. They'll bow down before your feet. They will learn that I've loved you because you have kept my word to persevere. I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So there's several different viewpoints on the latter part of verse 10. I don't want to get lost within that at this moment. Just look at the first part at the moment. The reason why the Lord loves them is because you have kept my command to what? To persevere. Okay. A lot of trials have derailed many Christians through the years. I have seen Christians who have left the faith, who at one time appeared to faithfully serve the Lord, but then they hit a trial. They hit a big obstacle within their life. Sometimes it had to do with their health, other times it had to do with even their family situation, but they would end up walking away from the Lord because the trial was too great. And so the goal here is we've got to persevere. And the brethren in Philadelphia, they did persevere, as we've already stated there in the preceding verses there. But you have kept my word about patient endurance, as the English Standard Version renders it. He says, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world. The church in Sardis, what did he say about them and the trial that would come upon them? You want to remember? Notice there in the church at Sardis, make sure I got that right, Sardis there. He makes the point there in Revelation chapter 2, there in verse 10, Smyrna. David, I had it wrong. Sardis is a preceding chapter. That's a bad church. Smyrna. Okay. I sure did. Okay. We'll go back. Let's redo the class so I can say the right words the right time. Sorry about that. Anyway, so church at Smyrna. What does he say about them? Yeah, that's right. That's right. He says, you're going to be tested for 10 days. You'll have tribulation. There's going to be a complete, and it's going to come to an end, period of suffering. They've just got to be faithful, even unto death. Exactly right. Same thing is still in the church of Philadelphia. They've obeyed the command to endure. It was a church in Sardis, of course, the preceding church here. That is the problems that we were looking at there. Man, I hate doing that. All right, any thoughts or any comments about this? Now, the trials he's talking about here, there are a couple of different ways to look at this. Fundamentally, the best way, I think, or the simplest way, is any trials of life that we have. Whether we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the persecution that some of the Christians would face because of the connection with Judaism, or if you look towards the, well, not just or, but from that point forward on into the end of the first century, the next 40 or 50 years, Christians were going to suffer on every single side. And so you've got to endure. You've got to persevere. The Lord will deliver you through. Even now, whatever troubles we've brought upon ourselves within this life, if we strive to turn to the Lord and follow Him and persevere, He'll deliver us through it. Does He make the problems go away? You know, the apostles, they were delivered from prison, by an angel. But the brethren in Smyrna, they were going to suffer for 10 days, as far as in the imagery there. And the people here, they were going to endure. The Lord did not stop the suffering. He did not stop the trials. But He says you will endure it. You need to endure it. And you need to obey my command, and you have command to persevere. And as a result, He will deliver them through those trials. Let's talk real quick, because bell's about to ring. Delivering through something. Okay. Tornado is coming through in your area there. And so you go down and you hunker down in your tornado shelter. And you hear the sound. It sounds like the whole house is falling apart. And it seems like it goes on for hours and hours. It's probably just a handful of minutes. And then finally, they come, they clear off the debris of your tornado shelter, and you come out. Were you spared the destruction of the tornado? No. But did you endure through it? Yes. And at some point, you come out to live another day, to start another day. And this is kind of what we're looking at. If we are patient, if we obey the command of the Lord to persevere and hold true to his word and take that stand as Ephesians 6 talks about, at some point, we will have deliverance from those trials and eternity with him in heaven. All right, any thoughts or any comments? Hannah.
I'll say, sorry, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, but he makes the way of escape, not like, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Is that not the same in what you're saying?
It is. The end result is the same. Because there in verse 12, he kind of comments about the history of the Israelites. He talks about the first 11 verses. So it says, therefore, to him who thinks he stands, take heed lest he falls. Okay. But then he explains they really had no excuse for falling. Because with every temptation, the Lord provides a way of escape. We've just got to keep looking and keep persevering. And at some point, we'll be to the end.
Yeah, it's a good comparison there. Yeah. All right, any other thoughts or comments? Okay, next week we'll try to finish up here with the church of Philadelphia and then move on to the lukewarm church, as your Bible may say, in Laodicea there. So let's start next week in verse 11. Appreciate your participation.